Welcome, everyone, to our session on achieving net zero in 3 steps, strategies for facility professionals. There's an obvious need for sustainability and decarbonization, with electrification and digitalization being major drivers for net zero. It's a huge topic these days. So today, during our session, we're going to learn from 2 experts on why decarbonizing operations was once revered as a nice to have, but it's now become more of a must do. And we'll talk about the main reasons that facility managers need to become one of the main stakeholders in the transformation of how to make this happen in a very practical way. We're going to learn from one hospital, how one hospital in the UK made it, what their experience was in their team, and lessons learned that can be shared with us and things that we can learn from ourselves. I'm Lori Gilmer. I'm the IFMA Global Chair. I'm also a professional engineer in my private life, and I'm excited to be joined by a couple of experts. So we're hosting our discussion with some of the players who are going to help in this advancement of making our buildings make that step over to net zero. So we'll take a minute for our panelists to introduce yourselves and the organizations that they play in their net zero building. So Paul, we're going to start with you.
Hi, thanks, Laurie. My name is Paul Cartwright, and I'm a Deputy Director of Estates and Facilities in the NHS, in the National Health Service. I work for Moorfields Eye Hospital, which I'm sure some people would have heard of, but we're quite a small little hospital, a small part of such a big thing as the NHS. My role is I have about 30 properties that I manage. Across a sort of a mixed bag of the estate. I've got some relatively new stuff, I've got some pretty old stuff, and pretty much every in between. And of those, some of them I have direct control, and others I have limited control, but I do have influence. And that is really, I suppose, where through my responsibilities of life cycle management, I have to forward plan, and that is really where I'm looking to align where I'm going with the wider NHS greener agenda, and obviously how that plays out with statutory obligations and obviously the desire to get green towards net zero. I would just mention that from a Moorfields perspective, we've got quite an exciting future in that we're replacing a very old piece of our building stock with a new property. It's called the Oriel project at the moment. Not sure what it's actually going to end up. It's a few years in the future, but that's our pet name for it, is Oriel. But I'm using that as effectively the catalyst for change across the remainder of my estate. So that's really where I'm heading. Thanks, Laurie.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Paul. Over to you, Kaz.
Yeah, so I'm Kaz Mohammed. I'm the Vice President for Digital Energy in the UK and Ireland at Schneider Electric. Ultimately, we work with a wide range of customers, primarily in the kind of building space, including Paul in healthcare, but also across universities, data centers, real estate, hotels, and stadia, to name a few. And the technology that we work with is primarily around that kind of buildings space. So we're talking here about BMS and control systems. We're talking about metering and SCADA and the digital kind of aspects that all come with that. And we've got a long-standing history in helping our customers and their sites in ultimately managing their energy and planning for that going forward as their estates take shape.
Very good. Thank you very much, both of you, for those excellent introductions. We are going to set the stage for just a second, and probably most of you have heard it, but we're going to go ahead and repeat it. 37% of our CO2 emissions are coming from our buildings. That's a significant percentage, and it makes our workplaces and our homes some of the biggest CO2 contributors. So Kaz, why is the retrofit of current buildings a must-have?
I think when you consider the challenge that we've got to ultimately reduce these carbon emissions and the agendas that have been set out and a lot of commitments around net zero, we start to consider, okay, we can do some dramatic things with respect to new buildings and having the kind of latest and greatest, but actually a significant amount of the stock that exists today, so around 50% we see, will remain by 2050. So if we consider that actually there's already a level of emissions that are associated with that 50%, then we've really got to have a look at how do we retrofit over that period of time, how do we renovate and improve that building stock ready for that kind of path towards net zero. And it's really important that we understand how that decarbonisation journey takes place and how we can do it over a period of time and not something that's just easily done kind of overnight. And you can see there on the slide that ultimately we've got to achieve around 3 times more projects in retrofitting, in renovation, to meet them net zero commitments and targets over the next sort of 30 years or so.
Very good. Thank you very much. So becoming net zero it's definitely a must-have, because how can facility professionals justify accelerating the process? I mean, that 3x goal that's a big one.
Yeah, so I think there's other trends and other kind of benefits to the path that we're talking about here. I mean, ultimately, we can see there's a trend around compliance and what is being looked at in various different geographies. So there are EU directives now where we're lowering the amount of controls, or the amount of controls that need to go into a kind of smaller footprint building is coming on board. So we're seeing now the need for controls, we're seeing the need for metering and understanding how a building is performing in a much smaller, medium-sized building, whereas before a lot of that legislation was set around some of the larger building stock. We see here in the UK, in particular around buildings which are tenanted, that there is a requirement around an energy performance certificate, and that energy performance certificate comes out as a rating, and we've just hit the marker where basically if you have a tenanted building, it needs to be a rating of at least an E rating. And over the next 6-7 years, that is going to move up to a B rating. So we can see there that in the next 6-7 years, there is a need for our building owners to ultimately upgrade and update some of them buildings going forward. We're also then the other aspects here where we're talking about price. And I think we've all felt this in particular in Europe, but around the world, where we've seen the shift in energy prices in the last sort of 12 months or so. And, you know, in some cases, ×2, ×3. So actually, through a process of retrofitting technology, through a process of improving performance of the building, we can see a real benefit in the actual cost of running that building over the long term. And then other aspects around just our expectations of what we expect out of a building. I think that this has changed and altered, and especially with a generation that are coming in now, and they're demanding a much healthier space, a much more engaging and connectable space as well, to ultimately work and live in. And we're going to see, I think, more of a shift around this with respect to people and where they ultimately get employed, and how they kind of move forward in their careers. And then just finally, I think this inefficiency topic. So if we really crack the code and make buildings smarter and more efficient and more connected, then ultimately there should be a better working life for the people that manage them buildings, the people that ultimately look after them and maintain them, just because out of the back of it, we'll see operational performance.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kaz. Paul, can you tell us a little bit more about Moreland's Eye Hospital Land? What were the main reasons that your facility started this journey toward net zero?
I think I'd like to start by saying we should all be doing it, but if that was the only answer, it would be a relatively simple one. But as Kaz alluded to a minute ago, there is some legislation, and the NHS is no different. You know, each trust has a contract with the centre to perform, and one of those current targets is on the greener agenda, and the NHS has made quite a bold statement in its ambitious net zero targets, and as a provider within the NHS, we've got to work with them to get to those targets. Now, the NHS and the wider healthcare industry covers medicine production. It's got masses of patient and staff transportation. I mean, just ourselves alone, we're managing somewhere in the region of 1,000 patient journeys a day. So that's one area that we should be looking at. But to get back to where my passions lie, our carbon footprint is nearer to 20%. Because we've obviously got a lot of it going elsewhere. But that 20% is still a very significant amount of emissions. And so with a building energy issue that's creating those high volumes of carbon dioxide equivalencies, we've got to start to look at why. And the main sort of area that I've got to deal with is an aged building stock. And moving on from there, obviously a net zero building has got to be great for achieving those carbon emissions. And it certainly provides an attractive route to the NHS, because when you've got aged buildings, they don't look great either. Now, you can look very nice internally, but it's also aiding the care and I'm not a medic in any way, shape or form, but it's aiding that care if the facilities look great, and we can paint them, but it's behind the scenes where the energy cost needed looking at. But I mean, Kaz mentioned workers as well, and we've got workers who want to, be in sustainable buildings, but I would also expand that to say that we've also got people who want to work on sustainable buildings. And, if we think about sort of some of the aged stock that I deal with, it's not attractive. I mean, I go back to when I started my career, and steam and oil were things. But our younger generations, these are things they see in museums. Come to my hospital. It's there. But trying to attract them into that type of industry, I think is going to be difficult. But actually, if you can, convert that with the use of technology, with digitization, with getting some controls on some of that old kit, suddenly it becomes much more, more techie that I feel as in that older generation, something that these guys are looking for. Lastly, I've also got to mention energy, of course, or certainly the cost of energy. Just as a context, in the last financial year, I was presented with a cost pressure of just over £1 million for increases in electricity and gas, across my utilities. That was up, a base of somewhere around about 40-odd%. We purchased well, okay, but I still got hit by those increasing costs. So it's not surprising that suddenly we've got our CFOs, our chief financial officers, actually starting to pay attention to energy bills now, and dare I say it from my perspective, what that actually means in energy management and even metering strategies. So that's why we were heading down that route. Is we've got to, we should do, and we need to, and that's really why we're going down it.
Absolutely. Great detail there. Thank you so much for that. So Kaz, I'm going to pivot over to you, and let's talk about what we can do to achieve net zero.
Yeah, so I think we believe ultimately that there's kind of two sides to it. So one is ultimately about the energy itself, where are we kind of getting that from? And here we talk about a future which is much more electric. So if we consider maybe a few kind of examples here of, our vehicle transitions, and we're seeing that we're having kind of one of the largest fuel transitions ever in history with the move from things like diesel and petrol to ultimately electric vehicles, and the infrastructure and the support that all kind of requires. But ultimately, we're taking carbon out of the system. We're taking that kind of view there. We've got the same thing happening in some of the buildings landscape here. So, traditionally in cold climate countries or mixed climate countries, we've got gas being used as a kind of primary heating source. Very much in the UK, we have this, and now we're seeing this bigger shift towards heat pumps, things like air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, and we're seeing that shift kind of come into the mix. So we believe that electricity is kind of key to that. Then the flip side is about the efficiency. So how do we make it more efficient? As Paul kind of mentioned it there, how do we make things more visible and actionable as well, ultimately? And here we talk about digitization. So, historically, we might well have had lots of different infrastructure on a site. Some of it could have been connected, but a lot of it would have sat standalone, would have sat maybe in a manual process. How do we digitize some of that, and how do we build the kind of tools that show you how to manage that going forward? And ultimately bringing them together is where we see the ultimate recipe to drive towards a much more sustainable and efficient building. And I think as we kind of zoom in on things, so if we move to the next piece here, which is around the kind of 3-step approach. So we've worked with around 50% of the Fortune 500 companies, and we wanted to try and understand how are they addressing the ultimate challenge of making their buildings more sustainable and efficient going forward. And they've kind of come up with, and what we're seeing is this theme, and we've curtailed it into 3 different areas. So it's a piece around ultimately, firstly, strategizing. So really understanding, what are you looking as the overall outcome? What are you looking to achieve? Who in your organization needs to be part of that kind of plan? So who are them kind of key stakeholders? And how are you going to measure kind of success and some of the milestones along the way? Then it kind of goes on to, okay, well, what's your baseline? How are you performing today, really? Are you digitizing enough that you really understand how your building and your assets are performing, and that you can ultimately drive some efficiency going forward out of that as well? And then you're driving kind of data-driven goals and data-driven success as well to measure that. And then finally is that last piece to decarbonize what you have. So you're left with then, okay, inefficient areas where you can work out, how do I make that more efficient? Is it just optimization of what I've got already, or is it something where I need to ultimately shift and change some of the technology or the assets that I've got on site? And leveraging this and keep going around in that kind of circle is ultimately what we're seeing a lot of the larger organizations start to do and move along these kind of 3 steps.
Very good. Thank you very much. So as we think about those 3 steps and sort of zoom in a little bit further on those, they can seem maybe a little bit theoretical to some. What would you recommend to our audience, Kaz? What tangible actions could they take to implement each of these steps?
Yeah, so I think if we start with the strategy piece, so tracking and probably having an idea of where you want to get to might be easier for some, might be more difficult for others. But as Paul's mentioned there, actually at a government level, at a UK organisation level, there is an ambition to get to a certain level. So straight away, you've got kind of a target there, maybe in sight. Then it kind of comes down to, okay, who do I need to bring on board to determine how we're going to get there and what some of the milestones are in our organisation? And I think this is where, again, it's shifted a little bit with respect to some of the stakeholders we would have once engaged with. This would have been probably sat as part of the energy manager, maybe the director of estates, but you're now talking at a CFO level, the engagement there. You're talking other roles within the business, some of the P&L owners and what have you in a business that would be kind of part of this, because they believe it's all kind of linked then to the business value that they can generate going down the line. I think that the baselining of where you're at today is really important. It's recognizing maybe what work has already taken place and where you've got to then kind of generate, okay, what's my short-term and longer-term kind of plan look like? And then it's being very clear on what are the other benefits that you're going to get out of the kind of planning going forward. So if, for instance, maybe a digital kind of infrastructure you might think in the first sight is going to benefit you from measuring how your building's performing, but it could give you improved operational performance. It could allow you to maybe extend the life of some of your assets on site because you know how well they're performing. You can react quicker to the ones that need more help, and rather than just kind of systematically planning everything going wrong, it could help in resources. So I think having all of that and deep diving into them pieces is really important as well.
Very good. And I think, Paul, could you talk to us a little bit about how the hospital approached this particular step?
Yeah, sure. So we took the route of creating a carbon reduction plan to integrate that into, I suppose you could call it a modernisation programme. We have got life cycle planning. We understand that things have got a finite life to them. And what we wanted to do was to actually understand from a carbon aspect how our modernisation was going to impact on that as well. Now, I mentioned the CFO earlier and metering strategies, and I approached him and I said, look, I want to demonstrate to you a roadmap. I really do want to show to you that not only is there potentially cost savings down the road, but there's also carbon savings. And if we do this right, we can achieve both at the same time. So that was something that we started to do. But of course, getting to those baselines that Kaz mentioned there also need investment. And obviously that was the other reason why I was talking to him, really, was because I needed him to understand that we needed to have some funding up front to be able to create those baselines. We were, pretty lucky in that we had good data at building level, but and through another project that this is what Kaz was relating to as well, that a project that they'd done with us was through the theatres project. We'd got some pretty good granular detail, and I was able to show the CFO that if we went from this really, 1 metre in a building to a number of meters in places, then we would get much better data. And from that, we'd be able to create much richer improvement programs. So that was really the first thing that we did was, as I said, carbon reduction plan and align it to that sort of CFO plan, because ultimately, we all say that the coup and the chief execs and all that are in power, but it's generally the person with the purse strings, isn't it, that we all must go running after. So that was really where we sort of started here. But we were looking also for what is available. We kind of understood what was achievable now, and talking with the CFOs, what would be affordable compared to a timeline, of course. But then we also wanted to see what was available and where the future might lie. And an example of that, I suppose, is CHPs. We've got combined heat and power plants. They're gas-fired, they're generating electricity, and the heat byproduct is being utilised to bolster our LPHW, our heating systems. Now they're gas-fired, so they're not on our green agenda. We want to get rid of them at some stage, with those fossil fuels. But the next best thing, really, I suppose, coming along the line is hydrogen. But they're not here yet. Those hydrogen CHPs are not here yet. So, we've got them on our plan. What I would suggest is that you put it on your plan for a future project. Start to build up a case for it over time. Keep up to date with the technology. And then when it's ready, make your case. And I suppose last thing, just going back to the CFO again, certainly in healthcare, and I'm sure for other businesses, it's a different balance, but we've always been balancing care and cost. And I wanted to bring in a third C to that, which of course is carbon. And if we can now start to balance all three of those, then we stand a real chance of getting towards that net zero. So my advice there, if there is one, is get that carbon measurement embedded into all your business cases, and that's what we have done now. We've been able to actually create a carbon measurement section within our business cases, and we've started to raise the flag for measuring carbon and monitoring it across all operational plans and business cases that we've got.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. So coming back to you, Kaz, on step two, we have our digitize phase. What are the most relevant actions for our audience?
I think there's a couple of aspects to the digital piece. So firstly, we talk about how a building is performing, and by that it means if you think about it as kind of half outage performance look like. Do you know what's the night load? Do you know what the weekend load is? Do you know what the normal occupancy is on a Monday? Do you know what it looks like in the middle of the week? I think these are questions that a lot of building owners and building maintainers are trying to ask and understand of their own building. So we talk a lot about making that invisible understanding more visible. So digitally connecting, putting in the relevant data or data points to collect on and understand what that looks like. I think we talk a lot about how we can centralize some of them data points so that you end up with one version of the truth. Because invariably, actually, we've got some customers, some people we work with, and they've developed different systems, different methods over time, and then they have discrepancies in data and they have missing points. And it's about actually getting that in a way which is quality, that you can rely upon, and that you've got some actual, you can challenge on that data point and say, I believe this is how we're performing, within a tolerance, and you can make some decisions off the back of that. So we've done a lot of work where we put in cloud-based systems to ultimately help with the computing power that's needed often in this case, but also allows you to make that data easily visible to lots of different users within estates teams. And then finally, I think with all of that data and connectability, there's a lot now that is available around kind of digital twinning. So here we're moving into a space where actually, if you have all of that performance data, it's in a granular form, you're able to now actually see how a building should be performing. You see how the asset should be performing. And with the right digital twinning tools, it will tell you when it's not performing right, and by what degree it's not performing, and what that looks like, and where is it on that particular asset, and even down to a level of what type of skilled engineer do you need to go and send out to that piece of kit to have a look at it? Is it a mechanical issue? Is it an IT issue? Is it an electrical issue, etc.? So we're moving more into that space, and this is really helping our customers not just be more efficient with their energy and the building performance, but also their workforce as well going forward. And I think it starts to put some possibilities in our minds, as Paul's talking about what the future plans are, of just what does that look like if you've got that level of insights interacting with your labor force. Is there then maybe a space where we actually move into a more of an AI type environment in the future?
Absolutely. And Paul, I saw you nodding your head earlier. I know you've got some things to share. How did this play itself out, this particular step, digitize at the hospital?
So I'll go back to the theatre project that I mentioned earlier, and it's an example of picking your targets at specification stage to achieve what you're aiming for. But it's also an example of where we were going to collect data. In one aspect, we didn't know that we were going to use it all. So I'll come on to that in a moment. And what I want to say is that the primary project was to replace some I will say antiquated. I'm not sure it would have turned up on Antiques Roadshow over here, but it felt like it. Some of its museum piece, some of this plant, and it needed replacement. So one of the first projects I did at the hospital was to create a specification to replace the plant. And we do validation of the airflows, and that plant had always managed to meet its targets, but the parameters changed, and we wanted to get a much better, closer control of not just how we were managing the plant, but also the outcomes, the products that out of the plant. And in theatres, we're constantly measuring airflow and air change rates. So it's for infection purposes or infection control purposes. Yeah, we try not to infect people. It's about the control of that. And so it was about that measurement. And so we came up with a specification and for all of that control. And at the same time, we said, well, why don't we try and measure the actual electricity usage at the same time? And that wasn't something that we would normally have done at that granular level, but we installed it at the time, a few years back now, and we started to see the benefit from that. And then that spanned a few other projects where we got to that level of granular detail. But going back to those theatres, when the energy crisis came along, we were able to suddenly look at this and go, do you know what? Actually, by tweaking this and tweaking that, now that we really do need to be energy conscious, let's have a play. So that really helped us. With having that optimized control, and we were able to pull that data out and turn it into meaningful intelligence and do something with it. But again, it does need monitoring, and so that was the other thing was by being able to create reports that were, you've got to have a behavioural change as well to a certain degree, and a mindset that you want to monitor this. So we've done that in the first instance. We were then getting the reports out, but we were actively, working our way through these. And one of the things that we started to notice actually with some of the granular detail was it was in correlation to where some of our maintenance asks were going. So that was what we started to do, was start to look at it, and a simple thing, we put another meter on the fan motors, and then just started to notice that it was drawing slightly more current. Okay, is there a problem somewhere? And therefore you start to get into old school world of condition-based maintenance, and suddenly the plant is telling you when to go and have a look at it, when the filters are starting to get blocked because the pressures are starting to build up a little bit, and then that really for us sort of turned a leaf and said, look, let's use that nice screens on the wall for it to come and tell us when to go to work. So I think that's probably where I'll leave it. But I think for me, the most important thing is certainly pick your targets at specification stage, but try and overachieve. Don't go under.
Very good. Thanks so much, Paul. Kaz, moving on to the decarbonize step, just a quick minute or two on the most relevant actions for that step.
Yeah, I think, look, this is a vital step. Actually, it's the most important, because we can do all the strategy and planning in the world and set our goals and targets. We can then start to make the invisible visible and start to understand where then inefficiencies lie and where the opportunities to improve lie. But this is really the action stage. This is about actually making them steps, as Paul's kind of touched upon there actually as well, in terms of understanding that is where the performance lied. This was the best performing area, and actually then there's an opportunity on the other areas to go, why aren't they as well performing? Can we make the tweaks? Can we make the adjustments? I think it's going further than that though as well, where we start to go, okay, is there an opportunity to link various systems together? If we're digitizing things and we're connecting things, so in the new landscape, am I able to understand how my space is being utilized and link my space occupancy to maybe the controls, and also link that to the lighting, and start to actually run that as a kind of singular system? That means ultimately I'm not reliant on human behavior to turn lights on and off, to turn the air conditioning on and off, etc., etc. And actually now I'm driving another level of kind of hyper efficiency there. I think when we start to get then into the maintenance world, all of the opportunities off the back of that are also there and relevant. So think about something just as normal and routine as a cleaning routine in a building. At the moment, that cleaning routine probably goes from room number 1 all the way to room number 30 in some kind of periodic fashion. But actually not all of the rooms could well have been used, and linking that kind of system back to the occupancy of a building just develops that next level of efficiency. So you can see there's possibilities within the energy space and the efficiency space there, but also outside of that as well.
Very good. Thank you, Kaz. And Paul, if you could share just a super brief example of what decarbonization looked like at your facility.
Yeah, sure. So our main aspirations obviously are in our Oriole, where we're going to have a lot of the air source, ground source, and solar PV, etc. But I think what we've been doing more is just replacing kit in a meaningful fashion that is going to give us our best bang for our buck. And recently we chose not to replace a gas boiler with a gas boiler. We did go electric. Okay, slightly more capital, but we thought that it was going to give us a much better target, because we knew that we had the CHPs in the background, and this was an occasional use. So I think it's really about understanding what your baseline is, looking at a measure, okay, and really trying to be most economical from a carbon perspective as well as a cost perspective. And I've just last to say, integration is key, echoing what Kaz says, but linking as many systems as you can together to try and get you to a point where you've got rich data seams that actually mean something.
Very good. Thank you so much, Paul. So seeing recommendations for our facility professionals, is very, very useful and helpful and relevant. And we're going to share with all of you in the audience at the end of this session, there's an e-guide. It's been designed in cooperation with Schneider Electric and IFMA, focusing on this topic and showing a few examples of how a retrofit was done and what the outcome was. So thank you so much for our panelists today, Kaz and Paul. We appreciate your expertise and the good examples that help illustrate how we can do this. So before we move on to Q&A, we've got a few questions that may be coming in from the audience. Kaz, what are your 3 takeaways from our session today?
I think probably the 3 to condense it down is one about that kind of stakeholder engagement. So Paul's alluded to the CFO there. It might be the CFO in your organization, but others, but it's how do you kind of engage with a wider community around this topic and really get that support across an organization. I think the invisible, making the invisible visible is really important. And again, Paul's kind of touched upon some examples there where maybe you're going to be replacing some equipment just through standard kind of life cycling. Maybe it's just time to update it. Well, are you really considering the future when you take them steps? Are you maybe incorporating some aspect of digitization for that particular asset, even without necessarily knowing how you're going to use that data kind of going forward? It's just incorporating that, which is much easier to do on the outset. And I'd say, look, this is not just about short-term gain. This is about long-term impact for the future. So go slowly initially to really understand how your building's performing, understand where then kind of spots are to kind of then go fast once you realize that.
Very good. Thank you so much, Kaz. Well, I'm going to start us with our first question. What skills do FMs need to address new technology with like digitization, automation, and decarbonization?
Do you want to go, Paul, or do you want me to go?
I'll let you go and I'll follow.
Okay. I think from my point of view, I think these topics can look quite scary on the outside. So I believe there's actually just that curiosity to go and get embedded with it, go and see, work with some of the manufacturers out there, the likes of ourselves, the likes of, IFMA as well, work with the people around you, some of the experts in the field, to understand it and help them to demystify it, because really it's kind of a lot of it is about understanding exactly how your building's performing. A lot of it is just about connecting up bits of assets that you're probably going to know more about than anything else. And I think the opportunity here, working in the sustainability kind of field, making that impact on our buildings and the future, is actually a key attraction point for people kind of coming into the sector. So there's a huge amount of people out there that want to make that difference and impact. And if you're doing something around this and it's meaningful and it's real, then I believe you can bring in the right kind of people and the skills going forward.
Paul?
I would echo all of that, and I think it's also about making it relevant. And I think what I mean there is when you've got a building that sits, a nice glass building as you're walking down the street, often people have no idea what goes on within that environment. And I think that's the lesson that we need to get out to the wider audience. And FM is, I think, underrepresented when it comes to schools and careers, etc. You know, we tend to think about heavy engineering, we tend to think about sciences, but actually you mix the two of those together and you've almost got FM. You know, you've got big lumps of plant running buildings, and you know somebody sat on a computer controlling it. And I think that's the message that we really do need to get out there. Is Gaz mentioned that it's scary. It is scary to look at, but make it relevant. And I think if you make it relevant, you'll make it interesting.
Very good, thank you. I've got another question, kind of pivoting a little bit on that question. When we think about the FM industry, one of the challenges that we have right now is shortages of people coming in, and challenges with getting people educated up to a skill level that's needed for not just what we need today, but what we need tomorrow. And so as we think about net zero and decarbonization, those are big topics that we're needing to address. So how do we deal with the people shortages and the skill needed for this transformation that we're talking about? I'll start with you, Gaz.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a challenge. No ways about it. And it was a challenge probably prior to COVID. I think it's just accelerated in the last kind of 2-3 years as well. So here at Schneider Electric, we're trying to look at it as not kind of one thing just to tackle in its own right. We're tackling it from probably 3 or 4 different routes. And one is kind of going back to grassroots of how many people came into the industry 10, 20, 30 years ago, which was through very good apprenticeship programs, making sure that they're relevant and that we're supported. And we're seeing a lot more in that space, in both our space and across the industry. So it's really tapping into that. We're also looking at programs around kind of lateral hires as well. So this is a really attractive space to work in. Working with the new technology, with digital tools, in a space where ultimately you can make an impact on the overall sustainability picture. It's attracting attention from those that might be in work, but they're in different fields, and they're going to need that kind of support and step going forward. So manufacturers like ourselves and other large kind of organizations, I think, need to reach out and understand what role they can play in kind of reskilling some of the resources that are out there, maybe from other sectors.
Very good. Paul, do you want to add to that?
I would just suggest something like partnershiping. So for my particular issue is pay, and competing as a public sector organisation with a private sector field. So one of the things that we've explored is to utilise the expertise of people who are in an upper echelon, and to bring them and bring up the level of the personnel that we have got on site. And then by doing that partnershiping approach, you've got access to the highest skill base, okay? But you're also growing your own development team, and or through development, your own team through development, should I say? And from that point, then you're also are sort of offering them another route. They could potentially, if they're any good, head off to the specialist world, or they may just become that really great all-rounder that you've got. Okay, but it's I think partnershiping with those highly skilled technicians that are out there, I think is a really good way to try and bolster your own teams.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Paul and Kaz. Once more, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. This has been a great session. As mentioned earlier, I'd like to invite you to download the e-guide. There's a QR code on the screen right now that you can use. It's the guide that was developed in cooperation with IFMA and Schneider Electric, the Retrofit for Sustainability of Facility Managers Guide for Net Zero Buildings. In this white paper, you can find more details on today's topics, as well as some practical recommendations that you can implement. There's operational checklists and things that you can help as you make your journey toward net zero. So thank you, everyone in our audience, for joining us today. We so appreciate your time and your attention, and let's all be encouraged in this journey onto net zero. There's some good and practical things that we can take forward as we go forward in meeting our goals. So thanks again. Have a great day.